I'd just like to thank Freedom for Faith for inviting me to speak, and the Village Church for hosting us here, and all of you for coming in person or online. So I'm approaching this not as a theologian, although I do thank John very much for what I thought was a very thoughtful and balanced approach to these issues from a theological perspective. I come at this as a former legal academic, a practicing lawyer who advises churches and religious schools both in preventive lawyering, how to maximise their protection under anti-discrimination law to avoid change and suppression practices, law liability, etc., and also as a defensive lawyer when things have gone wrong, but also particularly through both the Institute for Civil Society and as a board member of Freedom for Faith in terms of lobbying federal and state governments for better laws and protections for religious people and religious organisations. So I've got a lot of stuff on my slides, and I'm just going to have to liaise in a very intuitive manner with my friend at the back to make sure we move to the right spot. Thank you. So today I want to talk about the Religious Discrimination Act and the history of efforts to get a Religious Discrimination Act, a federal one, not a Religious Freedom Act. I'll make that distinction shortly, and the current ALP government position on that and what we can do to advance that. I will talk very briefly about the Sex Discrimination Act changes as well, but that's mainly going to be dealt with by Mark Spencer, who follows me. But the two issues are being progressed at the same time by the Labor government, so I'll mention those. I'm going to talk about why we need a federal Religious Discrimination Act, what it should contain, and how to get it done. Do not move to the next slide. Thank you. I just want to start with a bit of a provocation. I'd like us to reflect. I've been doing religious freedom lobbying for over 30 years now, and I'd like us to reflect on how we might work strategically and work better for religious freedom than we have in the past. And here are my points. They may or may not be controversial to you. I think for too long we have been in a defensive mindset, and we need to get out of our defensive crouch and play offence as well as defence. And I think we need to do that wisely, strategically, sensibly, taking account of everything John has said, that we can expect persecution and opposition, but we also need to assert as much as we can within a democracy the privilege we have of seeking freedom for religious people and non-religious people to live in accordance with their conscience. So we don't live in a dictatorship, we live in a democracy. We should utilise those privileges we have. As our cultural and political elites have moved more and more in a secular direction in the West, the value of religious belief and religious practice has been belittled and marginalised more and more, and past cultural freedoms and expectations which we enjoyed, Christians have enjoyed, have come under attack. That's not news to you, but that's particularly the case where there has been a clash between, say, religious views of sexual morality or religious views of relationships, human relationships, religious views as to the doctrine of the human person, sanctity of life, on the one hand, and those of secular morality, which are based on maximising individual autonomy and expressive individualism. And we see that happening in many, many different places. Now, it's understandable that if you're sitting you've been around for 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, and things have just been taken away and attacked here and attacked there, and your DGR status might go and this and that, and there's another review about taking away something else. It's very understandable to have a response of adopting a defensive crouch, bewailing the times and clinging desperately to what's left. But I think we need to be assertive as well as defensive, and we need to look for where we can advance, both in terms of public argument as to the public acceptance of the values for which we stand, the good that it brings to society, to go back to some of what Sarah was saying, and to push what's called the Overton window. The Overton window is that set of plausible outcomes in a society which might be achieved. In 1970, no Overton window in the West contemplated same-sex marriage. But over time, progressively, those in favour of it pushed the Overton window out so it became more and more and more acceptable as an idea. We need to be doing that. Instead of just playing defence, saying, no, we need to say, where is our Overton window? What are we pushing out to say, this is acceptable, this is good, this is a good thing, we should do this. And it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, it's going to take time. But we need to be on the front foot to do that. And I'm saying we can do this both with the Religious Discrimination Act and with some positive changes to the Sex Discrimination Act. The Religious Discrimination Act, the values behind that are that religious bodies and religious people need protection from discrimination because they're minorities like other minorities, and they're subject to being dismissed and looked down upon and discriminated against. The Sex Discrimination Act provisions for religious schools are there to provide an alternative to the state schools for those who want them. They teach values, they teach moral values, they teach religious values which parents want. We can see that from the numbers who go to religious schools. So let's create sustainable religious freedoms which allow us to deliver those things in society. Second point is we need to consider whether all the legacy ground that we cling to in our defensive crouch needs to be defended in its current form, or whether we could do even better. And this is my only reference I'm going to make to the Sex Discrimination Act here, but for example, Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act allows religious schools to discriminate in good faith in order, and this is the language of the section, in order to avoid injuring the religious susceptibilities of the adherents of the religion. So a religious school can do something which, in good faith, which protects the religious susceptibilities of the adherents of the religion. Now, that probably doesn't immediately convey to you anything, right? Other than that religious people are pretty fragile and need to be protected from stuff. But then you think, what do they need to be protected from? Well, that depends on the religious susceptibilities of the religious people. And then you've got to go and think. So other people come out, and you'll know who they are, and say, these people want to sack gay teachers and get rid of gay kids because they hate gays. And if you just look at the language, you might think, oh, that's probably right. Maybe that section does let them do that. Section 38 has served us well to this point. It does some protection, but I would say it's not sustainable in our current environment. It's not a fort. If I think of a little set of palisades that we're hiding behind, it's not a sustainable fort because it will keep coming under attack. But we could take all the things that we need, seek all the things that religious schools need, the right to teach their doctrine, the right to manage student conduct, the right to require their teachers to adhere to the values and of the school, the religious values of the school, and put them in and get rid of language of religious susceptibilities. In other words, we could put ourselves on a better footing, a less attackable footing than we are with Section 38. Anyway, I just want to throw those ideas out that we might need to change our model. Let me turn back then to the Religious Discrimination Act, and now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. In 2018, we had the Ruddock Review post same-sex marriage religious freedom review, and it recommended that we have a Religious Discrimination Act to protect religious people and religious bodies against discrimination. It did not recommend a Religious Freedom Act, and I just want to make that distinction pretty clear for you because we talk, fair enough, at a general level interchangeably about these things, religious freedom. A Religious Discrimination Act prohibits discrimination against persons or organisations on the basis of the religious belief or unbelief of the person or the religious activity of the person or the organisation. It's like age discrimination. I can't discriminate against you because of your age. I can't discriminate against you because of your religion. It doesn't mean you're an old person, you can do whatever you like, and it doesn't mean you're a religious person, you can do whatever you like. It means I cannot take adverse action against you on the basis of your religious belief. Okay? That is different to a Religious Freedom Act. Religious Freedom Acts come in many forms, but for example, in the United States, there's one that says, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act says, any government action which burdens religion must be justifiable in a court as being done in pursuit of a compelling government interest, and it must be the least restrictive burden on religion consistent with achieving that interest. That is, it holds all government action which burdens religion up to scrutiny. That's a Religious Freedom Act. It's much wider, and it deals with government action. A Religious Discrimination Act deals with government and personal action which discriminates against individuals or bodies. Now, our opponents through all this debate will constantly say the Morrison Government Religious Discrimination Act, and no doubt the Albanese, if the Albanese government ever produces one, is a Religious Freedom Act, to paint it as a much broader assertion of rights. It's actually an anti-discrimination act, like the Age Discrimination Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, the Race Discrimination Act, and all of them, whatever they are, Disability Discrimination Act, okay? It's trying to stop people discriminating against a minority. Okay, next please. Thank you. Why do we need one? Well, because I think there's plenty of examples out there. Just in Victoria in the last week, we had a pro-Palestinian office worker staff refusing to laminate a Jewish newspaper page for a man who was wearing a kippah. I would imagine he was Jewish. And he just said, could you laminate this for me? And the office worker said, no, we're not going to do that, I'm pro-Palestinian. And he said, but that's a political view, I'm just asking you to laminate a piece of paper. And she said, no, Officeworks has a policy, we don't have to do that. We don't have to take jobs. And he said, is that Officeworks policy that you won't laminate this Jewish newspaper, or is it your policy? I'm pro-Palestinian. And we went through all this back and forth. Now, I'm not sure whether that was religious discrimination or racial discrimination or political view discrimination, or it doesn't really matter. My point is that in Australia today, religious discrimination of that sort is not a biggie. Sex discrimination is a biggie. We know what that is. Race discrimination is a biggie. We don't do that. LGBTI discrimination is a biggie, and we don't do that. Religious discrimination? Maybe. So the Jews refused service at Officeworks because of their religion or because of their political views in favour of, I mean, this particular paper just said Israel, doing a good job trying to defend against Hamas. We have Christians demoted and sacked at work or losing the right to practice their profession. We have Christians suspended from university for expressing their religious views on social media. There are multiple documented cases of that at HRLA, and I've got that up there. And Dan Simon, I think, is in the room somewhere from HRLA. If you want to ask more about that, Dan, HRLA, Human Rights Legal Law Alliance, takes those cases for people. Muslim people are subject to discrimination. A Muslim woman's been refused entry to a hotel simply for wearing a hijab or a burqa, and you can read about their Islamophobia. And incorporated councils or Islamic associations, Jewish people are discriminated against. You can see the anti-Semitism report. And then we have this same thing existing with bodies, incorporated bodies. So an incorporated church, Baptist Church Proprietary Limited or incorporated, applies to use a school or a council hall to meet, and it's refused because of the religious views that were spoken of in the sermon. Well, that's the body being discriminated against, and an individual member can't bring an action because they weren't refused. They didn't apply to use the hall. The application was made on behalf of the body. If the body can't say we were discriminated against and doesn't have a recourse, then the net result is that the people associated with the body, the people in that case the Baptist Church members or adherents, don't get to use the hall. Now, there are federal laws prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of race, age, disability, sex, sexual orientation, relationship status and gender identity. And once you throw in sexual orientation, relationship status and gender identity, you immediately create the possibility for a morality clash between what the law says you can or can't do. You can't discriminate against someone on the basis that they're unmarried or that they have a gay sexual orientation or have a particular gender identity or gender expression with the moral values of certain traditional and religious groups. In state and territory laws, there are far more protected attributes, something like 16 to 21 grounds on which you can't discriminate against people in state and territory law. For example, you can't discriminate against someone on the basis of their physical appearance, their breastfeeding, or their political views. Okay, so these protected attributes are multiplying left, right and centre. In some states, there is already protection against discrimination on the basis of religion, religious beliefs or activities, but not in New South Wales and not in South Australia. So when Israel Folau was sacked in New South Wales for posting his version of 1 Corinthians 6, there is no protection under New South Wales state law. He had to go and use a section right up the back of the Fair Work Act. Now, most of the Fair Work Act doesn't help you in New South Wales or South Australia because although the Fair Work Act contains provisions prohibiting discrimination, it says, but if it's not unlawful in the state, under state law in that state, the Fair Work Act doesn't help you. So the Fair Work Act general discrimination provisions don't operate in New South Wales to protect you on religion grounds, nor in South Australia. Up the back of the Fair Work Act, there is a provision that says you cannot be unjustly terminated anywhere in Australia on the grounds of religion. And that's the one that Israel Folau used in his negotiations with Rugby Australia, and that's where he got his settlement. So it was in fact illegal under the Fair Work Act, and he got, not a case, but he got a settlement for that. Okay, next please. Religious discrimination not widely recognised as a big baddie. I've told you the Office Works example, the HRLA cases. I'd like to pick one from my home state. Andrew Thorburn was sacked by the Sneddon Football Club in Victoria as their chair in October 2022. He was formerly the CEO of the National Australia Bank, and in that role he had looked after many people, including non-discrimination policies for LGBTI and age and disability and so on. The reason he was sacked as chair of the Sneddon Football Club was because he was chair of City on a Hill Church, an Anglican church in Melbourne, and some anonymous person had very helpfully trawled through all the sermons at City on a Hill. So he was sacked the day after he was appointed, and pointed out to the Sneddon Football Club that, this is in 22, pointed out that in 2013 and 2016 there were sermons at the City on a Hill which expressed what more conservative religious people would consider to be orthodox but unpopular views, that homosexual sexual conduct was a sin and abortion was a sin. The president of Essendon said the day after appointing him, the day he sacked him, as soon as the comments relating to the 2013 sermon from a pastor at the City on a Hill Church came to light, we acted immediately to clarify the publicly espoused views of City on a Hill's official website. Sure enough, the stuff was on the website, or at least in the archives of the website, which are in direct contradiction to our values as a club at Essendon. And the board made clear that, despite these not being views that Andrew Thorburn had expressed personally, light bulb, so you go to a church, in fact you're the chair of the church, and in 2013 and 2016 someone, not you, at the church said these things. We can't have you. They were also made prior to him taking up his role as chairman, but because he was the chairman of that church, Essendon thought he could not continue to serve in his dual roles as the Essendon Football Club chair and as chairman on City on a Hill. And then with a completely straight face and not being aware of any irony at all, they said, Essendon is committed to providing an inclusive, diverse and safe club where everyone is welcome and respected, except you, because we're sacking you. They didn't say that last bit. And Daniel Andrews said, those views are repulsive. Now, it was a clear case to me, and indeed to Josh Bornstein, well-known Labor lawyer, of discrimination on the basis of imputed religious beliefs, contrary to the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act. But the Commissioner for the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, who had been appointed by the Andrews government and was formerly their Gender Rights Commissioner, Ro Allen, Ro is non-binary and goes by they, when asked on radio whether this was religious discrimination, said, and I've checked the quotes, it's definitely a values conflict to employ someone who's not just a passive member of a church but on the board. Ro also said, you can hold your religious views in Victoria. And then Ro said, good on Essendon for standing up for their values. Now, Ro is the statutory appointee who would have to decide on any claim of religious discrimination brought to the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission by Andrew Thorburn. Do you think you're going to get a fair hearing there? That's what lawyers would call apprehended bias. So Thorburn didn't go to the VHREOC, but brought legal proceedings, and he achieved a settlement, including an apology from Essendon, because what was done was illegal. But my point is this, in the public perception, it's not illegal. It's not a big baddie, it's those people over there. So we need to raise the profile and say, why is religious freedom good? Why is it reasonable that we shouldn't discriminate against people? And I think pushing for a Religious Discrimination Act is part of that. Next slide, please. Why do we need a federal Religious Discrimination Act? Well, we need to protect, first of all, individuals and organisations in New South Wales and South Australia from religious discrimination, and individuals across Australia from Australian government discrimination by Australian government agencies and funding bodies. We don't have much of that yet, but there is nothing to stop it if it came. So the ARC might decide that it wasn't going, maybe it has already, the Australian Research Council that is, might decide it wasn't going to fund religiously motivated research projects at Catholic universities or Muslim tertiary institutions if we get some. Secondly, to protect religious incorporated bodies from religious discrimination on the basis of religious beliefs or activities of individuals associated with them. So I gave you the example of the Baptist Church trying to rent a hall. Right? If an incorporated religious body can be subject to religious discrimination without recourse, and the government says, well, you're not eligible for a grant, we're not providing you with assistance to run that soup kitchen or whatever it is, because you're religious, then the religious people who express their religion and community in that body have no recourse. Because if the body can't bring an action, none of the individuals were denied the grant, none of them applied, none of the individuals sought the renting of the premises, they weren't denied. Religious Discrimination Act needs to cover discrimination against religious bodies as well as individuals. Thirdly, to help educate Australians that religious discrimination is wrong, is as wrong and as illegal as discrimination on the grounds of sex, race, age or sexual orientation. Fourthly, I think, as a Victorian, to give a federal complaints alternative to potentially, let me say, unhelpful state and territory anti-discrimination bodies. Now, I've been in New South Wales many times, and I know that some people in New South Wales think this is the hotbed of the remnant of Christendom in Australia, and therefore it's not a problem that's a problem for people south of the Murray. But I would point out to you that you have adopted our Abortion Law Reform Act. I'd point out to you that you've adopted our Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, and I'd point out to you that you've adopted our Change of Suppression Practices Act. I think Christendom is crumbling. In fact, it's gone, right? So let's not assume it's all going to be good in New South Wales. Let's get some federal help here to protect all Australians across the country and to give really I'm looking for a line in the sand or a flag in the sand saying religious discrimination is as bad as these other types of discrimination. Next is to make it clear that religious bodies and schools have a positive right to preference regarding staff and volunteers and members. And that is what the RDA would say. It would say it is not discrimination for a religious body to preference in employment or in volunteering or in membership persons who have the same religious belief as the religious body. That's just like politicians. I remember I said before that in a number of states and territories it's illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of their political views. And that is very sensible when you're going to get something laminated at Officeworks or you're going to buy a tub of yogurt at Woolworths. Your religious views should be utterly irrelevant. But if you're applying to work for the Greens, I think they could legitimately ask, what are your political views, and not employ you. And if you're going to work in a church, they could legitimately say, you seem to have a strong Muslim heritage. Do you still hold to Muslim? That's a legitimate question, and in that context, or a Christian school, that is a legitimate context for you to be able to say, no, we preference in this place people for congruent religious views with the church or the school or the mosque or the Muslim school. This is for all religions, not just Christian. Okay. Finally, the right to preference is, I've just made that point, it's just like political parties. It's not bad discrimination, it's good discrimination, because what we're trying to do in this country is to build a multicultural country, well, multicultural in the sense of multiple different way of life organisations that say this is the best way to live this way. But those organisations, in order to say that, have to be able to hire and keep people who are ambassadors for the cause, who have the same values and live out the same values as the organisation. Okay, next please, thank you. So if we look at where we got to with the last attempt at a federal religious discrimination bill, this was the Morrison government bill in 2021. And its bill banned discrimination against individuals and their organisations on the basis of religious belief or unbelief. It protected atheists as well, and religious activity. The bill permitted religious bodies and schools to preference people of the same religious beliefs, and it overrode a 2021 Victorian anti-discrimination law which actually limited the freedom of religious schools to preference in employment. So it would have replaced a Victorian law which limited which expanded the exposure of religious schools to discrimination complaints in Victoria. The bill did not authorise discriminatory acts against any person on the basis of other attributes like sex, sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is a very important point which is often lost. A religious discrimination act deals with discrimination on the grounds of religious belief and activity. It says nothing about discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity or sex. Okay? So it's saying here, you can hire someone if they have the same religious beliefs. You could discipline or terminate someone if they no longer have the same religious beliefs. It is not directly speaking to the question over here of being gay or being trans or those issues. Those issues are dealt with under the Sex Discrimination Act. So just remember, Religious Discrimination Act, religion. Sex Discrimination Act, Sex Discrimination Act attributes. The Religious Discrimination Bill was a reasonable and balanced law. It was fought back and forth on a few points. It was recommended to pass by 2 all-party parliamentary committees on the 4th of February 2022, and that's thanks to many of the people in this room who put in submissions and a lot of hours of work. And it was passed in the House of Representatives by 90 votes to 6. Mark Spencer tells me it was 91 votes to 6, whatever. It was an overwhelming majority. The ALP voted for it. The Liberals and the Nationals voted for it. Everyone voted for it except for the Greens and a couple of crossbenchers. But we were outsmarted because in an accompanying bill of amendments to other human rights legislation, there was the ALP, the Greens, the crossbenchers and 5 Liberal MPs who decided to cross the floor said, we want to put in a provision to remove protections in the Sex Discrimination Act which allow religious schools to teach their doctrine and manage student conduct on the basis that, Mark will talk about this later, but on the basis of a narrative that religious schools discriminate against gay teachers and gay students. So we're effectively, the whole of the Religious Discrimination Act, which is otherwise supported 91 to 6, is gazumped because of another issue which is not logically nor in a policy sense connected. Nobody really disagrees with the proposition that religious people and religious organisations should be protected from discrimination. Even Equality Australia, the LGBTI lobby group, says, oh yeah, that's fine. We're happy with that. But it was gazumped because they twinned it politically with this other issue over here about schools. But it need not be connected with that issue. Okay, so we end up with a stalemate. The government couldn't afford to have the same result in the Senate, which it didn't control, so it pulled both the Religious Discrimination Bill and the changes to the Sex Discrimination Act. Next slide, please. Oh, we're over there. Okay. Coalition promised to reintroduce the same bill at the election. The ALP said it would address religious discrimination as a priority. That was in April 22, but did not say how it was going to do that. The ALP did say that religious bodies could preference people with the same religious beliefs in hiring but not after hiring. That's sort of being half pregnant. The ALP was elected, as you know. It provided a new reference to the Law Reform Commission on how to change the SDA to do 2 things. One is to ensure that religious educational institutions must not discriminate against a student or staff member on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, relationship status or pregnancy. And, on the other hand, they could continue to build a community of faith by giving preference in good faith to persons of the same religion as the educational institution and the selection of staff. Right. Now, if you're looking puzzled, that's because you should be, because, in fact, there are some religious convictions that have to do with sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and marital relationship status. And if I'm hiring people with those convictions, that means I'm going to have some difficulties over here, or vice versa. So in fact, they're given an impossible job almost, the governments are trying to appear even-handed in this terms of reference, but actually the 2 goals are pretty difficult to reconcile. The ALRC reports in March 24, and its report is to abolish all of the protections for religious schools in the Sex Discrimination Act, take out section 38. So no protections in hiring and no protections in relation to student management or teaching doctrine, etc. Interestingly, on the 12th of April at a conference at the University of Notre Dame Law School, the Commissioner on that reference, Stephen Rothman, in a speech said he was constrained by his terms of reference and he believed that, contrary to what was in the report, the law should give a positive right to a religious body or educational institution to discriminate in favour of a person, a staff member, on the basis of their religious beliefs or adherence to religious tenets. Now, that's a very interesting position, isn't it? Where the report says A, and the Commissioner later says, I was constrained by my terms of reference to say that. What I would actually do is B. In April 2024, the religious leaders had written to the Prime Minister saying, we're not happy about your current proposal or the ALRC outcome. And in April 24, the PM promised faith leaders in a meeting, this is Muslim, Christian, Catholic, Anglican, Jewish, etc., Hindu, that religious freedom protections for faith groups will not go backwards while I'm Prime Minister of Australia. And then the ALP government begins confidential consultation with a group of religious leaders about a draft Religious Discrimination Act. Next slide, please. Okay, I know this is a history lesson, but it's helpful as to what comes next. Now, I can't tell you what's in the government's current drafts on the Religious Discrimination Act and the Sex Discrimination Act. Some people in this room have seen it. Many have not. That's because the government has said it needs to be kept tight as a drum to this limited group. What I can tell you is what faith leaders have asked for in terms of changes, or not changes, what they like to see in the legislation. So faith leaders, these are the key asks, not all of the asks. Faith leaders have asked for all of the content of the prior government's, the coalition government's, religious discrimination bill, for which the ALP voted in 2022, saying, you voted for this in 2022, do it again. And that includes a positive right for a religious body to engage in good faith, in any conduct that a person of the same religion as a religious body could reasonably consider to be in accordance with the doctrines, beliefs of the religion. And that includes giving preference in hiring and employment decisions, and also in membership and volunteer roles and services to a person with the same religion. Now, there are some nuances there, which I won't go into now, but broadly, if it's a question of service delivery in a religious hospital, aged care facility, accommodation provider, you can't discriminate against the recipient of the service on the basis of their religion, but you can discriminate in terms of, well, it's not discrimination to preference your staff. You can continue to hire for people who staff in those institutions. Secondly, religious faith leaders are asking for incorporated religious bodies to be protected from religious discrimination in order to protect the religious individuals who use those bodies for reasons I've explained. Thirdly, and this is very important, if good faith conduct of a religious body is declared not to be religious discrimination under the Federal Act, then it will not be unlawful discrimination under state or territory laws. I don't have time to go into that now, but all around the country, all the state and territory law, religion protections are being wound back and wound back and wound back and wound back. And what this is trying to say is, if we can do this under federal law, if we can preference for staff and volunteers and members under federal law, that should override, to the extent of inconsistency, a contrary state or territory law. That is very important, because otherwise we're just going backwards at 1,000,000 miles an hour in states and territories. And fourthly, and there are many other points, but fourthly, religious bodies and schools that hold a traditional view of marriage cannot lose their charity status because of holding that view. Now, I'm going to go for 2 more minutes. Could I have another slide, please? Oh, no, the other matters slide, I apologise. Go back one. Thank you. Religious vilification. Now, that is on the table in this bill because the ALP wants it, but the faith leaders have come to that is Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, etc., Muslim, etc., have come to a view saying we could include a civil prohibition on religious vilification, provided it is not a blasphemy law. So the conditions for any support of this would be the prohibition must be limited to any conduct a reasonable person would consider would intimidate, harass or vilify another person or group on the grounds of their religion, not insult, not offend, not threaten, and there must be a defence, and this is a very important point, must be a defence for any conduct engaged in for a genuine religious purpose. That would be teaching, that would be evangelism, that would be prayer ministry, etc. and there must be no requirement that the religious purpose or belief be reasonable and be tested in a court as to whether or not your religious belief is reasonable. Right? So with those significant caveats, there is an agreement, well, there is a preparedness to support a civil religious vilification provision. I should say there are worse proposals out there from the ALP in terms of a criminal vilification provision. There are worse proposals out there in Victoria and Queensland for vilification provisions. So it's not as if this is the only game in town. Right? Okay. And lastly, the overlap of the religious discrimination and SDA discrimination needs to be resolved, and I'll come to that. Last slide, please. Where to next? Religious leaders wrote to the government in May with a detailed set of proposals for a Religious Discrimination Act and a Sex Discrimination Act. And Mark can talk more about that. The government said we'd like to do this on a bipartisan basis. Religious leaders said, fine, we'll copy our response to the opposition. We're now more than 2 months, nearly 3 months since those letters were written, and the government has not provided any response. Crickets. What the government said, or what the Attorney General said, oh, we're waiting to hear from the opposition as to whether they'll support it or not. Religious leaders are now writing back saying, we're not negotiating through the opposition. You asked for our comments and our submissions. We've given it to you. It's now 3 months. It's time for you to tell us what you're going to do. We understand you want bipartisan support, but until you say what you're going to do, you can't really expect the opposition to say what they're going to do either. You're the government. You started the ball rolling. You've initiated this. It's up to you to respond. Now, my point is this. The government needs a political reason to move forward, and currently they're playing this game of, oh, we can't move till they move. And the opposition says, well, we're not the government. We can't do anything till they move. And so we all just float along to the next election. That's where we're currently in this holding. It's like flying to Sydney Airport, with all due respect. You're in a holding pattern, round and round and round. So the faith leaders are trying to break that delaying tactic by calling on the PM to give a detailed response to faith leaders. But we need support, because the government needs a political reason to move forward, and that will only come from the urging of people of faith and faith leaders and organisations that we need an RDA. We need an RDA, and we need good changes to the SDA. Not any changes, but good changes that don't take us backwards on the SDA. See, the government could get bipartisan support with the opposition on an RDA. I think that's not too difficult. The SDA is far more contentious. So here's my suggestion. Let's urge both to be done, but let's open up the possibility for the government to say, do an RDA on a bipartisan basis in this parliament, and if you can't get bipartisan support for an SDA, well, we'll all still be here next year, and we can argue it again at the election, or we can argue it again in another 15 parliamentary committees. But do what we can do now, which is a Religious Discrimination Act. Thank you.